Okay, so we're moving into a panel. The next panel is on conflict reconstruction in the Middle East, like post-conflict. And we're starting with, we have 5 speakers, and I've been asked to give 15 minutes for each speaker.
15 minutes?
15.
It's a lot.
I know, I thought so. It's a lot.
15 minutes
Okay.
for each speaker, that's a lot.
يعني إحنا كرمة بس فيكم. You can have 10. Let's say 10 minutes for each speaker, so we will leave the time and space for people to engage and raise questions. The first speaker is Anas Al-Ghumati, Sadiq Institute. Anas is the founder and current Director General of the Tripoli-based Sadiq Institute, the first public policy think tank in Libya's history, which was established in August 2011. He's also the research director for the Institute's Security and Governance Program. He has held several positions in the region and in Europe. He was formerly a visiting fellow at the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut, Lebanon, a member of the UN Libyan panel of experts, and a visiting lecturer at the NATO Defense College in Rome, Italy. Anas, 10 minutes. Oh, sorry, yes. Yes, yeah. Okay,
Thank
please.
you very much. Good morning. Thank you very much to the Baker Institute for organizing this event, to IFI for hosting us, and to yourselves for giving us your schedule this morning. Just a quick word about the Institute and some of the work that we're doing and its relevance to this discussion. So Sadiq is a public policy think tank and a research center. It's based in Tripoli. We have a couple of staff based in our office, but we have around 40 to 50 researchers now in our network that work across East, West, and South Libya. Most of them are working on this subject primarily, so we've been mapping conflicts over the last, local conflicts over the last year, and trying to map the private sector to try to understand, A, what does post-conflict reconstruction look like in Libya, what are the needs and demands, but also how do private sector interests or business interests intersect the conflict. And it's been a fascinating journey to understand whether or not these interests are apolitical at times, neutral, immune, or whether they play more negative roles, or they perhaps fuel local conflict over resources and competition within the private sector. And many of those things exist, and they're certainly relevant for this discussion. To give a quick overview of Libya's conflict, without necessarily going into too much detail, but trying to give it some degree of justice. In 2011, the revolution that started in the eastern city of Benghazi, which I'll speak about shortly as an example today of what reconstruction looks like, certainly brought together many of Libya's illiberal youth, many different demographics and different tribal groups and constituencies. But crucially, in the security sector, it fell apart along tribal lines. And Libya's tribal patronage that had existed under the former regime, the choice to promote, elevate, and use certain tribal blocs to disproportionately represent them in the political, military, security apparatus, was certainly a way in which one can look at the falling apart of Libya's security sector, and then begin to look at how revolutionary and then by consequence quasi-formal and formal security institutions were built. So on the one hand, you have many tribes that had enjoyed patronage for over 30 to 40 years under the former regime and gave them little choice. They weren't defectors, they couldn't defect. You may have certain individuals that politically defected, came on television, took one flag down and put up another flag. But you wouldn't really find many of Libya's military institutions being offered the exact same choice. Now, there were defections, but largely it was pitting those that had arms against those that were either A, receiving arms, or B, destroying barracks, entering barracks in the country and receiving arms that way. And I think in that sense, you can begin to see how Libya's tribes really played an influence and really played a strong role in shaping much of the conflict today. Certainly in understanding the way in which tribal cleavages and competition within the security sector has been rampant, and that really lasted between the former regime and the emerging structures in 2011. Started in Benghazi, moved across to Misrata in the center of the country, Tripoli by late August 2011, and obviously much of the south as well, Sabha and other key cities across Libya's periphery. But it took power, essential real power, from one tribal bloc to another tribal bloc. And it was the assumption that those tribal blocs that had just lost power would just sit back and say, okay, that's fine. As if nothing would emerge, nothing would happen. Those tribal actors, those security actors, those crucial stakeholders and blocs were kind of up for grabs. And what happened between 2011 and 2014 were elections and many other key milestones in Libya's transition, but this issue was never addressed. This lack of equity when it comes to potentially power sharing agreements in the security sector, when it comes to understanding the way in which we could have inclusive, and I know we've had panels discussing this already, inclusive political sharing agreements amongst various tribes or various individuals that represent those tribes. Those things weren't addressed, and effectively it led to a very, very highly competitive space, which by late 2013, Libya's de-Baathification law, de-Ghettoification law, or the political isolation law, effectively put an end to. So after the drafting of that law in the passing of that law in May 2013, it effectively separated and excluded all of those that had enjoyed patronage under the former regime in either the political, military, security apparatus, but including many of Libya's public-held economic companies, because it was a socialist regime and much of the private sector existed, not really in the private sector, but under the auspices of the state. It effectively marginalized and excluded all of those actors, and effectively it ripened many of Libya's tribal groups, former politicians, military stakeholders. It ripened them for conflict. It said, this is the only way that you're going to move forward. It's either fight or flight at this point. You can't stay back and remain neutral. And that environment, those grievances were exploited by a new campaign, I believe, and I think perhaps this is quite a contentious claim to make, but it's certainly my read on the situation and my take on the situation, that by May 2014, Operation Dignity, that was led by and created by a former general, Khalifa Haftar, exploited those grievances in the city of Benghazi, where there had been deep social grievances with respect to the absence of a security sector, a formal security sector, assassinations, and the prevalence and the proliferation of new Salafi jihadi groups on the scene, and exploited those grievances by offering two things. A, speaking to the local population there and saying, here are your problems, I'm addressing them, and B, looking at the have-nots within the tribal structure, within the military apparatus, those that had lost power in 2011, and making them an offer and saying, if you come and join me, not only will I bring you back to power, but I have the narrative to bring you back to power. There's no more of this, you're a revolutionary, and if you're anti-revolution, that somehow this is a really pejorative thing. No, we'll do this under the auspices of, we'll build a police and an army, and that's what Libyans want. A police and an army is a very vague term. If you just shout, Jaysh Shurta, and you continue with the sloganeering of the Arab Spring, and it was really done through sloganeering, no programs. Sha'ab yurid, and Isqat al-Nizam is not really a program, it's a statement, it's a slogan, and it leaves nothing to the imagination, or it leaves lots to the imagination if you're an interesting politician with grand ambitions. But it leaves nothing in terms of the population's understanding, or the local population's understanding about what political life may look like. And it is again central to this conversation that we're having about post-conflict reconstruction, because I think it addresses three things. The first is the easy things, and well, not necessarily the easy things, but the very visible things of reconstruction, the reconstruction of infrastructure. Socio-economic delivery, or public service delivery and socio-economics in Libya, but also much of the Arab world, is not only failed, but it's a sense of inherited failure. It's something that myself, born in the 1980s, I didn't create. I wasn't responsible for the abysmal and shocking educational services, the dire transportation services, the shocking and deteriorating and now destroyed public service delivery of electricity, waste, water management, and so forth. Those weren't of my doing. Those are things that I was just born into and I had to inherit. But post-conflict, they're not only deteriorated, but much of it is destroyed, and that's what the first item on the bill is to address: reconstruction of infrastructure. The second is the reconstruction of communities and societies, in a way in which, when one looks at the displaced, externally displaced, and the internally displaced in Libya, one has to imagine how to bring those communities back to their cities where they live. Today we're talking about one city in Libya. Last night, the attempted return of a displaced city, Tawargha, back to its city, which failed yesterday. And obviously the return of much of Benghazi's population back to the city after the conflict. And those things, crucially, are not being addressed. And they're critical for the peace-building part of reconstruction, which is not being addressed. But it's the third and the final, which is the most lucrative, it's the most seductive, and it's the reconstruction of the state. It's the reconstruction, the reimagination, it's the blank canvas that a painter can look at and say, this is the kind of life that you will lead, and reconstruction is that vital connection to that. It's an opportunity for those that are in charge of cities like Benghazi or in charge of a country like Libya to be able to say, with this donor money or with this money that we've now inherited by having our hands on the public coffers, this is a way in which we'll reintroduce not only the local population but the international community to Libya 2.0, to new Libya, to a Libya post-revolution, where not only are we using this money to perhaps reconstruct the infrastructure, but we're also doing it to deliver money to our regime patrons, to the key stakeholders that may have backed us, and also to let Libyans and the international community know who is in charge and what those terms will be. And so it's that final point, and I think it's doing research in a city like Benghazi, where we just completed our research a few weeks ago. It's trying to understand where that relationship is being built, and it's trying to understand it within a new context. And the context is, not only is Libya looking to reconstruct and rebuild the state, but it's also being given a new roadmap, a new lease of life, in inverted commas, by the UN, who have decided under Ghassan Salama's new patronage that they will move towards elections over the next coming months, perhaps as a failure or a result of the failure of the dialogue that took place and the agreement that took place in Skhirat and Jazair over the last 2 years. And I think it's the absence of that conversation that is really vital to reconstruction, because that's reconstructing political life and public life in Libya. That failure to be able to ripen Libyan stakeholders and political elites towards crucial peace-building activities, towards pragmatism and compromise, towards power sharing that failed, and to assume that elections that are hugely competitive spaces will somehow lead towards stability and will somehow lead towards an answer, a final answer, without using that term badly, but a final answer in terms of the way in which Libyans will elect and live with a new regime, a regime with ideas in its mind about the way in which it wants to conduct reconstruction along those three different lines. But it will also do so with a fresh lease of life, with an electoral mandate, a legitimacy to not only distribute wealth, reconstruct the economy, but also to ensure in front of the international community's eyes that not only are we legitimate, but we have the legitimate use of force in our hands. We can pursue political opponents, military opponents, in a way in which we deem suitable under the banner of legitimacy, under the banner of elected legitimacy. And this was done, and I'm sure Dr. Tariq Mitri knows this already, having worked on Libya for many years, but the first, unfortunately, and this is a real cynical thing to say, but the first thing that elected parliaments in Libya do in 2012 under the General National Congress, the House of Representatives in 2014, is to quite literally ram the idea of legitimacy down your throat. We are legitimate. We don't care what you think. We've got the ballot in our hands now. We can pretty much do whatever we want. If we want to bring in, if we want to conduct a military campaign, we're legitimate. What's the problem? Once they lose that legitimacy, they kind of go quiet, but they continue to do what they wanted to do in the first place. And I think that's really where most of our problems lie. So I don't want to go much further than that, but I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Anas. Thank you, Anas. Our next speaker is Mr. Mansour, who is a research fellow for the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House. His research explores the outlook on Iraq's transition and the Dilemmas of State Building. Mansour was previously a lecturer at the London School of Economics, where he taught courses on international relations in the Middle East. He has also held teaching positions in the Faculty of Politics at the University of Cambridge. Since 2011, Mansour has been a senior research fellow at the Iraq Institute for Strategic Studies in Beirut. He received his PhD from Pembroke College, Cambridge. Mansour. Now I found the right person.
Yeah. And most importantly, I was previously a fellow with my boss sat next to me at the
Yes.
Carnegie Middle
I thought so.
Center.
I thought so.
With the Carnegie Middle East Center. So I suppose I'll reflect on Iraq. As everybody knows, very good news, ISIS no longer exists in Iraq, as the news, as media is telling us. That's there's supposed to be laughter after that because of the hopefulness. Unfortunately, Iraq, despite going through the next stage of state building, still faces massive challenges ahead. So what I want to do, I suppose, is kind of reflect on these buzzwords that we continue to use when looking at something like Iraq. Words like inclusivity, words like reconciliation, words like state building, and whether we actually are talking about the same thing that's needed on the ground, right? For example, has the Iraqi state since 2003 been inclusive? If you look at it along identity lines, I think a lot of people would say yes. It's had a Kurdish president, Sunni Speaker of Parliament, and a Shia Prime Minister. There's been a post for many of the minorities as well. So is that the kind of inclusivity that we're looking for when we're moving forward? Because if it is so, in Iraq, we're good at it. But unfortunately, I think there are, and in Lebanon, yeah, and other places. But unfortunately, that's not the case. So what is this? First, what I want to do is kind of look at what happened in 2003. How did we get into this mess? In 2003, the Iraqi state was destroyed and reconstructed. Reconstructed, although the word was regime change, although the plan was for regime change, right, which required much little effort and much little forces, much less money, what really happened was state change. Remove the military, remove the civil service, remove much of the party, and really, in a rentier kind of state with money coming in from so many international donors, sow the seeds of fundamentally a weak state. Who were the new builders of Iraq? And now I know a lot of attention is on the Western, sort of the US and its allies, but I think it's also important to put blame on the Iraqi leaders themselves who came after 2003. Who were they? Fundamentally, they were diaspora, political parties, based on a constituency of sect or ethnicities. So the Da'wah party, for example, which has been leading Iraq since 2005, wasn't necessarily sectarian in tone, but all of its members were Shia, right? The Kurds weren't necessarily sort of sectarian in tone, the KDP, the PUK, but all of their members were Kurdish, right? These two became the main builders of the new Iraqi state, both of which had lived outside Iraq for many years and were traumatized by the memory of a strong state. So the state they decided to build, they put in a few new buzzwords: decentralization, federalism, all these great things that sound great on paper but don't translate on the ground, really led to the cycles of collapse and repair that we've had since 2003 in Iraq. And so that's the kind of state. As federal state, a weak central government that's unable to provide sovereignty in many of its areas, leading to the most recent collapse in 2014 when Daesh took over 1/3 of their territory. Now, because of inclusivity in Iraq, power has always been diffused, right? So we talk about elections, and one of the things about this whole rebuilding of Iraq now is there's going to be an election this year, as if elections determine power, right? In 2005, Ibrahim al-Ja'fari won the election, Nouri al-Maliki became the prime minister. In 2010, Ayad Alawi won the election, Nouri al-Maliki remained prime minister. In 2014, Nouri al-Maliki won the election, Haider al-Abadi became the prime minister, and yet we're still talking about elections as if elections are the determinants of power. No. Power is diffused, both institutional and non-institutionally, and so power will always be a compromise. So Haider Abadi most recently had to reach out to some of the Shia paramilitaries and militias under the popular mobilization units because he has to, because that's how it's always been under the banner of inclusivity, right? Another buzzword that I want to sort of get into in the talk today, reconciliation, right? If you want to convince a Sunni and Shia Kurd to get together, they won't have much problem with it. The problem is who that is. They've been getting together for many years. Reconciliation at the top-down reconciliation isn't the challenge. It's reconciliation at the bottom level. And that doesn't, and we need to, I think, remove identity from reconciliation as such. And focus on sort of the challenges of state building. Provide a state and the nation will build itself. This is what Wand Lins argued. Wand Lins argued that the state building comes before nation building. There's no fundamental, and sectarianism as such we know is elite-driven. Sectarianism is a top-down force used by certain elite to gain legitimacy, to create constituencies. Now these diaspora parties that emerged had to create their constituencies based on their identities or their ethnicities. And even today, this is the case. So these are some of the bigger challenges when we talk about reconstruction, when we talk about rebuilding. The roots of the problem that is the weakness of the unitary state continue to exist today. So in a few weeks, there's going to be a meeting in Kuwait. Everyone's talking about it, international donors talking about it. Throw money at the problem again. They're going to pledge a lot of money. Actually, I think the Iraqis are not as hopeful. They won't get enough as they want. But in any case, there's going to be a lot of money continuing to throw it at this problem, in a situation where power remains diffused, where institutions remain weak, and where legitimacy isn't necessarily very clear. So then I want to focus on what I think in my research are two of the key challenges to how can we actually move past this unitary state, and what are the challenges? One, and as Anas was talking about, this idea, if you want to use a Weberian sort of definition of what a state is, monopoly over legitimate violence, where is legitimate violence in Iraq? Because for many Iraqis, particularly in 2014, the state army was the least legitimate army after having fallen to Daesh over a few days. If you look at, for example, al-Hashd al-Sha'bi, the popular mobilization units, Shia militias, are they legitimate? Well, according to Iraqi law from November 2016, they're a state entity. But ambiguously worded, the first line of that law says al-Hashd al-Sha'bi is an independent force with the state. So there you have room to play, but nonetheless, if you speak to a lawyer or a judge in Iraq, he or she will tell you that it's a state army now, it's part of the state. Don't act like a non-state. Two, there's a certain element of religious legitimacy given to al-Hashd, right? Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani issued a fatwa. Now, even though he didn't want the volunteers to join the Hashd, even though he has never used the word al-Hashd al-Sha'bi ever, because he fails to recognize it, he nonetheless provided that kind of legitimacy for thousands, tens of thousands of volunteers to join these groups. So there's a religious element to it. Finally, there's a popular element to it, particularly amongst Iraqi Shia. Most polls conducted continue to show that very high levels of Shi'is recognize the Hashd as popular, as legitimate. Now they have martyrs. Many celebrate the martyrs. Many will say that the Hashd, and to some extent rightfully so, the Hashd were on the front lines defending Iraq in the early days of 2014 when Daesh was coming in and the Iraqi army was crumbling and the Peshmerga were kind of defending or taking over Kirkuk at that time. So there is also a level of popular legitimacy. So the question becomes, how do you deal with this, right? This is not a 2008 Jaysh al-Mahdi kind of moment where Nouri al-Maliki can just oppress the militias, right? They're to some extent legitimate. What's more dangerous is they represent both state and non-state. They're a hybrid armed actor. They can pick and choose what to be. Right? So at the federal level, some of them are competing in election, and I'm sorry, I know that the Hashd, it's a huge group and there's many different ideologies and groups within. I'm speaking of some of the stronger groups, the Badr organization, Asa'ab, Ahl al-Haq, Al-Nujaba, and some of the stronger groups that are closely tied to Iran. In any case, they'll compete for elections, If they win, they'll be part of the state. If they lose, they can also be part of a non-state actors, and they can continue to have power in both realms. This kind of hybridity of the Hajj represents the biggest challenge, I think, because it fundamentally undermines the Iraqi state. They kind of act sort of on the side, parallel to the Iraqi state. And if the assumption is that reconciliation, that inclusivity and all these things are contingent on a state being there, some kind of state, then that's problematic. I don't know if I have a lot of time, but I also want to look at the informal economy. There's something that's not very much addressed. But since the 1990s, sanctions from the international community, an oil for food program, and these areas created the need for Iraq to establish an informal economy of smuggling networks, and really, again, blurring that line between state and non-state, formal, informal. Those same Ba'athists who created those sort of networks would then go to advise Daesh in the early 2013-14 onward and help them create that kind of networks. Those have still not been addressed. Those smuggling networks, which fundamentally undermine the state because you have much of the wealth of the state moving away from different hands, has not been addressed yet. The war economy and the informal economy is something that requires further research, I think, because if you continue with top-down initiatives, if you continue to throw money in an environment where you have elite that can take that money and use it for their own interest or use it for different interests and not the interest particularly of either the provincial councils or the federal councils, then that's a problem for the future sort of our understanding of the state. So very briefly, moving forward, there is a phase of reconstruction. There is a phase of rebuilding. Iraqis are to some extent positive, optimistic. You know, Daesh was a dark sort of history in Iraq. 2014 is an embarrassment for many Iraqis. So there is a sense of optimism moving forward. The optimism as well because the identity-based politics are being questioned. So you have things like Shi'i in Baghdad or in Najaf or Basra protesting against their own Shia leaders. You have Kurds in Slaymaniyah protesting against their own Kurdish leaders. You have Sadrists and communists competing in the same electoral list, right? And they became friends because when they both started protesting, the communists, after the protest, used to go and have drinks and play music, and the Sadrists liked the music, so they started dancing together. And some kind of some kind of bond formed, but they're now electorally together because they're on the same page. The biggest issue in Iraq is corruption. Right? Much more than sectarianism. So there is a fragile opportunity there to move towards issue-based politics. I know Maha works on this in Iraq and Lebanon as well, but it's very fragile, and what I've outlined today represents spoilers for this process and this optimism.
Thank you. Thank you. And much of what has been said about Iraq could be said about other countries in terms of the war economy and other elements. Yeah. Our next speaker is Maha Yahya. Maha is the director of the Carnegie Middle East, where her work focuses broadly on political violence and identity politics, pluralism, development, and social justice after the Arab uprisings, the challenges of citizenship, and the political and socio-economic implications of the migration-refugee crisis. Prior to joining Carnegie, Maha was a colleague. She led the work on participatory development and social justice at ESCWA. We still want her back. She was previously the regional advisor on social and urban policies at ESCWA and spearheaded strategic and intersectoral initiatives and policies in the Office of the Executive Secretary that address the challenges of democratic transitions in the Arab world. Yahya is the author of numerous publications, including Great Expectations in Tunisia, that was published in March 2016. Maha.
Thank you, Khawla, and thank you, Qadir and Tariq, for having me with you here today. This is a great panel, I have to say. We're off to a great start. I think the topic of reconstruction and rebuilding has never been so timely for this region it's never been this timely, basically. And that the context we're discussing reconstruction is also particularly challenging. Khawla, Renad, and Anas have already laid out some of these challenges. I mean, we're working in a region that is more polarized than it has ever been before. And we're not just talking about the Saudi-Iranian rivalry, we're talking which is seeping into everything across the region. Sunni Shia, questions of legitimacy, questions of sovereignty. I mean, all of these issues have an impact on the way states and societies operate and the prospects for rebuilding, reconstruction after devastation. At the same time, this kind of polarization obviously is shuttering down spaces for dissent. It's creating a kind of stabilization, which is a stabilization, at least the stabilization that is being discussed today. It's almost like a pact between authoritarian states. And we're seeing this across the region in peace deals that are being struck in Iraq or in Syria or in other places. This kind of stabilization is not one that is very conducive to reconstruction, at least reconstruction of a better future. I mean, as everyone celebrates, and Renard, I think, eloquently talked about this, at the end of ISIS, at least for now, the destruction that's been left in its wake is massive. Over the past year, 3 major cities in Iraq and Syria alone were reduced to rubble: Aleppo, Mosul, and Raqqa. The need to rebuild these cities, just these cities, is enormous. And yet, with the exception of Mosul, where there is some discussion of how to go about this, Aleppo and Raqqa are being left up in the, up for grabs in a way. And in the wake of this destruction, they leave a social fabric that has been completely ripped apart. And I don't know whether we can call them governance mechanisms, but there is a real gray zone in these places where there isn't much governance really happening in many, many different ways. In Syria, there's an ongoing Astana process, which to a great extent has displaced the Geneva. And what this has done also is it's replaced a much needed political transition with this concept of de-escalation, as if the conflict in Syria was purely a military matter. Sieges continue in eastern Ghouta, a mere 72 kilometers from where we are today. And with Assad in power, the refugee flow is unlikely to be reversed. And reconstruction, I think, will be a long time coming. And I'll talk in a bit about what reconstruction in Syria, since, again, there's a buzzword here, and I know in Lebanon everybody's waiting for the reconstruction boom. I'll be puncturing a few holes in that one, but anyway. For host countries, the continuation of conflict basically means that Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey, they have to find ways to meaningfully address the needs of populations who are not going home anytime soon. Just to give a sense, Lebanon, as you all know, has at least around 1 million officially registered refugees. There are another 500,000 that are, the government says, are here informally. Jordan has an equivalent number. Turkey has a much larger number. I don't need to discuss the dire conditions in which these refugees live. The scale of displacement that we've seen, if we want to talk about the broader regional context, the scale of displacement and devastation that we've seen in this region is also, humongous. It's unprecedented. So just to give one indication, this region makes up 5% of the global population, and yet it hosts 50% of its displaced and refugees, just to give a sense. So what reconstruction effectively are we talking about? So in this kind of broader context, this leaves me with a number of questions around concepts such as reconstruction. And I'll throw out a few of these questions that I have. What do we mean by reconstruction? Are we talking about simply, and Renat talked about the need to bring, and I think Anas, the need to have people be able to go back to their areas of origin. We've been doing this work with refugees in Lebanon and Jordan for the past year, and the one thing they keep, the key demand that they have, other than safety and security, is that they are allowed to go back to their homes of origin. But does going back to your home of origin mean that you're going back to things as they used to be? Obviously not. Given the scale of devastation, given the scale, the transformed power structures on the ground, there is no going back in that way. This does not mean people should not be allowed to go back home. They need to go back home, but we should not think that by allowing people to go back home, this is simply we are reconstructing Syria as it was, or Iraq as it was, or Libya as it was. And I think this is quite important and quite fundamental in the way we think about reconstruction. Societies that have witnessed severe traumas, is that even possible? Is there such a thing as reconstructing things as they were? I'm thinking of the Yazidis, excuse me, of the Yazidis, the Yazidi community in Iraq, for example. Can one blame them for the demands that they are making today in terms of the kind of political vision they see for Iraq? For asking to have, I mean, I know there are demands by some in the Yazidi community to have an independent provincial council within a larger federal state. The lack of trust at the local level, and I totally agree with some of what Renard was saying about what does reconciliation mean in this kind of a context. The lack of trust at the local level between communities that have coexisted for centuries is, I think, fundamental and one that needs to be taken into account when we talk about reconstruction. If we want to talk about development, and this is something that Khawla, I think, covered very eloquently in her keynote, we're talking about it's a considerable rollback in development across the region. We have millions of children today who are literally without an education. But even worse, we also have, I don't know if there are millions, there's no accounting for them, but children who have witnessed atrocities that no child should have witnessed. I think of the cubs of the caliphate in Iraq. I think of the children born out of forced marriages or consensual marriages to former ISIS fighters that are being completely rejected by society and that no one really is paying much attention to. These are the future of this region, or they form part of the future of this region. So when we talk about reconstruction, where does that leave these different kinds of populations, and how do we deal with these traumas? When we worked in our work with refugees, what we realized, yes, there is, the question of timing, what comes first? Do we do socioeconomic reconstruction and then nation building will follow, or the people will come together automatically? The kind of timing, do we think of reconciliation and transitional justice as part of reconstruction? How do we deal with questions of accountability and impunity? In Lebanon, for example, the way the civil war ended was with la ghalib wa la maghlub, no victor, no vanquished, meaning that an amnesty law was passed that forgave all war atrocities, and no one was held accountable. Perhaps we can think of the Hariri Tribunal as the first instance where political assassinations without impunity were, someone was being held accountable, or an attempt to hold someone accountable for a political assassination. The question is, had this not happened in 1990, would Lebanon have been able to turn the page? The downside of it is that this kind of amnesty law allowed the leaders that were the militia heads that were responsible for the 15 years of conflict to actually enter into government. And to my mind, it basically took the logic of conflict from the street into state institutions. The extent to which, 25 fast forward to 2017, 27 years later, or 2018 now, sorry, the state institutions have been considerably weakened at the expense of, to the credit of these political leaders / military leaders. So another question is, how do we account for the transnational nature of the war, of wartime orders, and how will this impact post-conflict scenarios and the reconstitution of environments and societies, even states? I'm thinking of the hybrid borders that were discussed by Renard, but also the kind of border networks that have emerged in the region, whether they're smuggling, whether they're trafficking in human beings across the region. How do we engage with this in a meaningful manner? In a region that is undergoing a violent transition and where conflict is likely to continue in the foreseeable future, how do we address the mass displacements that I spoke about earlier? Finally, I mean, I just want to sort of, as a kind of closing, just to reflect a little bit on Syria, because I think this is where a lot of, with the exception, I mean, other than Iraq, there's been a lot of buzz in the international community recently about the prospects for reconstruction in Syria. Today, the reconstruction playbook that is used by international organizations usually relies on funding through the central state. In places like Syria, where the state is not only complicit in the conflict, but has actually accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity, this has significant implications, i.e. reconstructing through the state has significant implications. Basically, this would mean a number of things. It means, at least at the international level, that questions of accountability and impunity can be overlooked at will. It has significant repercussions for the international order and for international understandings of justice and impunity and accountability. Within Syria, what this means is that the regime will be able to basically channel the reconstruction funding or any funding that comes to it into the areas that it deems as beneficial Syria or the areas that it considers fundamental and important areas. And this is not on sectarian terms, because the conflict in Syria is a political one first and foremost. It has taken on sectarian overtones, but it's a political conflict first and foremost. So it will allow the regime to channel whatever funding comes towards the areas that it deems beneficial to its own future. It means that the areas that were considered as against the regime, and these are the areas that were already the poorest before the conflict started, will continue to be further impoverished. And it will allow the government to create the status quo in a much more terrible manner than before. And I think this is something that we really need to think about when we weigh the advantages and disadvantages of thinking about any kind of reconstruction funding flowing to Syria. Just as a last word and as a caveat to this, and this has obviously implications for the return of refugees. When we look at the framework that the regime is putting in place today, the legal frameworks that the regime is putting in place today, these do not indicate that the regime has any interest in either allowing people to go back home or allowing refugees to come back to Syria, unless they are the refugees that it considers part of its own constituency. I'm thinking about arbitrary vetting laws that are being put in place. I'm thinking about the housing and property reclamation laws that are being put in place. I'm thinking about the conscription laws that are being put in place. And I won't go into these details now, but I can definitely elaborate more on these in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maha. Our next speaker is Nadim Shahade. Nadim is the director of the Fares Center for Eastern Mediterranean Studies at Taft University, Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. He's also an associate fellow for the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House. He was formerly a senior member of Anthony's College, Oxford, where he was also director of the Center for Lebanese Studies from 1986 to 2005.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Mata. Nice to see you, and nice to see so many friends in the audience. Now, I was given a homework by Dr. Qadir to speak about Lebanon, but yesterday we had such an amazing panel on Lebanon that I wonder if I have anything to say. I mean, it was a wonderful combination of an academic, a politician, a think tanker, a practitioner, and a policy activist. And it was, even though it was a brilliant panel, I think it left us all more confused and knowing less than when it started. So I'm going to escape to try and look at the regional dimension, which was not touched upon yesterday, and link it a bit to the subject of the conference, which is basically transition or post-conflict reconstruction in a way, the words we use are very significant. If we call it transition, you're going from one order to another. Post-conflict reconstruction means there was a conflict or a civil war, or all these words are very loaded. And what are we transitioning or moving to? Is it democracy, state building, la samahallah, or cohesiveness, or even nation building? I mean, we're trying to dismantle the states rather than rebuild them. But we do have 3 examples of transition which are very significant. I mean, the KRG, the Kurdish regional government, started transition in 1991, and we can see that the KRG is in a far better state than Iraq, which started transition in 2003, and Iraq is in a better state than Libya, which started transition in 2011.
So there is hope, you're telling us.
Well, no, I'm saying that there is a consequence. No, there's a consequence to having had Gaddafi or Saddam or Assad or Mubarak or whatever. He looks so tame now. Or any of these dictatorships that paralyze society, that create a dysfunctional state. So you can't just emerge from that and immediately run a marathon. I mean, Egypt went backwards. Syria is not yet started. I think it is absurd, and I agree with you, Mahad, that we cannot talk about reconstruction. I'm so glad you left ESCWA, because you can speak freely now.
We are not talking about reconstruction in ESCWA also.
My view is that we are transitioning from the 20th century, and it's a global phenomenon. The 20th century started around 1870. It was an early starter and finished a bit late in 2011. The model of the state that emerged globally functioned roughly between 1945 and 1985. And it's been in crisis since then till 2011, which 2011 was the year of the Arab Spring, but it was also the year of universal human rights. I mean, you had riots in Europe, in Spain, in Greece, in Beijing, in Portland, Oregon, in Occupy Wall Street, Occupy St. Paul's. It was almost a universal phenomenon, questioning the role of the state and the relation between the state and between the 20th century state and the individual or the group, so telegraphically, it's the model of the 20th century was borrowed from Bismarck's Prussia, if you like, and we don't know where we're going, so I can't give you an answer, and that's the problem that we have to approach when we are talking about reconstruction. Are we talking about re-establishing what is collapsing, or are we talking about something new that is emerging? And this something new that's emerging may be totally anathema to our values, because our values are based in the 20th century system. And now in our region here, we saw a model emerging. It's probably variations of the Turkish Kemalist model with the Ba'ath Party, Arab nationalism, Nasserism, Bourguiba, and all these variations in Libya, Sudan, Algeria. You can almost say that it extended to Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan during that. And it is the ideal of a strong nation state, homogeneous, sovereign, with equality, citizenship, cohesiveness, inclusiveness, I'm not sure about freedom or liberty. It was sort of relegated to the back burner a bit. Sorry?
Where is this state?
Well, this state was the one that was the ideal state.
Okay.
I mean, this state exists in reports of the United Nations, of the IMF, of the World Bank. If we look at them in 2009, Syria was brilliant, Egypt was fantastic, Libya was on the right path. Lebanon was a total failure.
Tunisia was doing amazing.
Tunisia was doing amazing. So the state does exist in our mind, and the values of that state emerges in our mind. Now, the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring. There's controversy about the word, but I have my own definition of the Arab Spring. Can I borrow this?
Of course.
It's a spring, you know. Is this federal property? No,
I don't think so.
No, good.
Not anymore.
It's a spring like that. So the more you press on a spring, the higher it will bounce, and basically when it bounces, it's a bit unpredictable which way it will jump. So we really don't know where we are bouncing from. We have springs bouncing from a century of pressure in all directions, and we are confused and afraid, and we're trying to seek refuge in the old model, which may make things worse. For example, Iraq could have started transition in '91, but we chose to maintain the pressure on that spring, and in 2003 it was worse. So the more the pressure, the higher it will jump. And it's not a mystery. What we've heard today and yesterday is very interesting, because we can see those springs emerging. So if you think of an ideology like the Ba'ath Party, which is secular, nationalist, modernist, socialist, strong army, wants to fight, national unity, all of that. The opposition is exactly the opposite. The opposition is religious parties, which were banned, ethnic parties like the Kurdish were banned, tribes are re-emerging, local elite parties like the National Bloc are reconstituting themselves from different cities. So all these springs are emerging, but we don't like them, because we are still stuck in the values of the 20th century. So we like Assad better, basically, because Assad conforms to the model we are comfortable with.
Don't say we.
To the ideals of equality and all that secularism, cohesiveness. Just read your reports, not yours. So Lebanon. Where's Lebanon in all that? Lebanon, in a way, skipped the 20th century. We never achieved that model. We were hoping to do so. We were always aspiring. We always felt we almost reached the point where we reached it, and my friend Dr. Nawaf Kabara wrote his thesis on Shihabism, regretting that it failed. I'm possibly thankful. Yeah, if Shihabism had succeeded, maybe we would have become a 20th century state, and we would be revolting against the Deuxième Bureau today. So Lebanon, because it skipped the 20th century, is possibly ahead of the game. It's ahead of the game because we have no state to dismantle. We don't need to get used to living without the state. And we have a 60-year sort of head start in learning how to live together, for better or for worse, with the help of Dr. Brahimi from
every once in a while.
We can't
911 Brahimi.
we can't fragment really, because we are already so fragmented in a sense. Lebanon, in a way, is a remnant of the past system, which failed to transition into the 20th century. Never really made it. We always wanted to, and sincerely deplored not reaching it, but we never really made it. And now we're sort of ahead of it in a way. And also, there's also a question of how much of Lebanon is really Lebanese, in the Lebanon we know, in the sense that Lebanon was also, in a way, when the regional order of the Ottoman order, the regional order composed of empires, collapsed, we had the remnants of that order come to Beirut. Beirut was a very small town in the early 19th century, and it grew because of people coming from the region, from Damascus in 1860, the Armenians, from southern Turkey, from Alexandria, Cairo, Aleppo, Damascus again in the 60s, Baghdad, Mosul, Palestine, of course. We live in Ras Beirut, which is a Palestinian refugee camp from Haifa. It's and so quickly to go through what this means in terms of the crisis of Lebanon. Lebanon is portrayed as being constantly in crisis, but in effect, Lebanon, those crises were attempts to modernize the country. So all the crises, like 58, 69, 75, and onwards, and even 2006, were attempts to create a modern, homogeneous, secular state that would fight the Zionist enemy, that would be sovereign, and all that, and it failed. So the crisis where the failure of the Reformation is now a kind of a blessing in disguise. For we are still out of the woods. I wrote a small piece in 2006 saying that there are two visions of Lebanon. One is the Riviera, one is the Citadel, and that they are totally incompatible and at odds and in conflict. And my friend Percy Kemp wrote back saying that I'm wrong, and I think he's right, because the two visions of Lebanon are, in a way, we are seeing it now, complementary. They are complementary. The Riviera, which is the decadent, laissez-faire, merchant, cosmopolitan republic, cannot exist on its own, and the Citadel cannot emerge in any other country in the region which is ruled by a strong state. So you couldn't have had the PLO emerging in Egypt or in Syria. It emerged in Beirut as a state within a state, and you couldn't have had Hezbollah emerge anywhere else. Although we are seeing it now emerging everywhere. So we saw this. We saw it last month. We saw how, well, not last month, last year, in the last 2 months of 2017, when the Citadel felt the loss of the resignation of Hariri, because the Citadel needed Hariri's support or legitimization to protect it. If Hariri wasn't there, the Citadel would be in far more danger and less sustainable. So this sort of precarious formula, or the balance of or the equilibrium of unstable forces, sometimes works. Now, to end, where are we going? Are we reconstructing the old system, which is the 20th century system, or the one previous, or are we coming into something new? We can see that the Ottomans and the Safavids are sort of emerging with control over the region. we can see that the cosmopolitanism of the Ottoman Empire is also
eroding.
Eroding and re-emerging at the same time. The decentralization and the 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 cosmopolitan Ottoman city was at the same time cosmopolitan, at the same time very segregated. You had the Jewish quarter, the Turkish quarter, the Greek quarter, and the Arab quarter, and all that, and they all went and locked the door behind them, but during the day they mixed in the middle. So there was security and mixture. So maybe, maybe that's in fact the misunderstanding of the Lebanese of the Lebanese system, which is that when Michel Chiha wrote about it, he said that protecting the boundaries allowed for coexistence. So in a way, when if the springs are not feel no pressure, then they are stable. So if you create a situation where people can coexist without putting pressure on each other, where the boundaries are protected, they can live normally, and they have. So we are in a situation of flux in a sense. So I will end there. I think I've gone a bit over. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Nadim. Thank you, Nadim. And our final speaker is Frances Brown. She's a fellow for the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where she researches stabilization, state building, and local governance in fragile states, with a focus on Syria. In her 15 years as practitioner prior to joining Carnegie, she most recently served as Director for Democracy on the White House National Security Council staff in the Obama and Trump administrations. Her previous roles include several years with the U.S. Agency for International Development and non-governmental organizations, including 5 years on the ground in Afghanistan, Lebanon, and surrounding countries. She holds degrees from Yale University and Johns Hopkins, and is completing her PhD at the University of Oxford. Frances.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here. And it's particularly a pleasure to be back at AUB because I was an exchange student here 18 years ago in 2000. So a long time ago, and I don't believe this beautiful auditorium and building we're here. I recall the auditoriums being much more crowded. So it's really a pleasure to be back. I also taught history down the road at the American School ACS for a couple years, 15 years ago. So anyway, it's a pleasure to be back and to talk to you about Syria. But in actuality, I really want to talk to you about foreign donors and their modes of approaching Syria. I come at this from a comparativist background, having researched stabilization, political transitions, and state building in other countries. As was mentioned, I come at it from both a researcher perspective. I've also worked on the practitioner side, so I have great sympathy for the challenges that are faced, and I've also most recently served in a policy capacity. So I have some understanding of all three angles of that triangle. My central argument that I want to persuade you of today is that as Western donors approach their support to the opposition in Syria, they brought with it, they essentially transposed wholesale the liberal state building model that they had used elsewhere. And with that projection of the liberal state building model came all the inherent contradictions and dilemmas and challenges that we've seen elsewhere when this model has been applied. My preliminary focus is going to be the United States, although in some cases there were similar approaches used by other donors, but given the complexity of the time period, I'm largely focused on the US approach to both policy and then local council programming on the ground in opposition areas. Obviously, this doesn't relate to the UN approach. That's a distinct and separate issue. So before I describe to you how Western donors projected this liberal state building model, let's quickly review sort of how Western approach to Western support to local councils evolved over the time period of the conflict, so 2011 to the present. In my read, very much simplifying, but in my read there are basically three distinct logics, three distinct periods of Western donor support to local councils. The first I would put roughly 2011 to 2014. This is in the era of the Obama statement, Assad must go. Given developments elsewhere in the Arab world, there was a sense, almost an anticipation that Assad would indeed go, that he would be the next to fall. And as a result, there was a real haste among Western donors to start working with local councils, to have some local entities on the ground with whom they could liaise. The sense of an imperative to have some local capacity ready to go for the hypothesized day after. This was framed in a binary understanding of the war at this point. It was the Assad regime versus the opposition with its multi-parts, in the Western donor initial framing. The next period that I see, again, these are sort of very rough delineations given all the complexity. I would place it about 2014 to 2017. In 2014, the United States formally acknowledged and prioritized the emergence of ISIS and the eventual decision to start a counter-ISIS campaign, put together the global coalition. This obviously acknowledged that it was no longer a binary war. There were multiple players. At this point, the U.S. started referencing, or internally, there have been reports that there were discussions about the idea of catastrophic success. What if Assad did fall and gave way not to moderate opposition, but more extremist groups? As a result, consequently, the support to local councils and the logic of that became a lot more complicated. There was, particularly after the Russian intervention in 2015, there was much less sense of certainty that Assad would fall. And so with all these different dynamics, the way that local council support was framed during this time began to be more about maintaining space for moderate actors. So not necessarily knowing or planning for a day after, but just maintaining space. It was obviously a complex logic, and there's been a tremendous amount written on U.S. deliberations during that time period. So the final period that I would underscore is 2017 to the present. Obviously, when the Trump administration came in, it formalized the prioritization still more of the now defeat ISIS campaign, and the Assad must go chorus became sidelined. Also, as this group knows very well, the military map of Syria became even more complicated and more fragmented. What does this all mean for local council support? It means, again, that local council support is also tremendously fragmented and disparate. There's now emergent support to SDF cleared areas in the east, the RCC, other more bottom-up efforts there. As well as in the presence of shrinking space for the opposition in the Northwest, there's shifts in local council support there as well, as some of those groups in the Northwest have been increasingly influenced by HTS and other groups. So in short, it is now complicated. I do not have a crystal ball to say where this will go. But so with those three periods, roughly 2011 to 14, 14 to 17, 2017 to the present, I do see some themes emerge, and I do see several ways in which the Western donors transpose this liberal state building model onto the Syrian opposition support. So the first echo that I see to the liberal state building model is this focus on service delivery as a means to build legitimacy. This is a driving assumption of many Western external state building endeavors. It comes from a very sound intuition that is by service delivery, that is how the state will build legitimacy, or in this case, that is how the rebel governance state will build legitimacy. The comparative evidence actually suggests that it's not always that straightforward a relationship, that it's not necessarily an issue of providing more or closer or better services that lead directly to legitimation of the local governance actor. Other issues matter as well: perceptions of justice, perceptions of grievance being addressed by the services, perceptions of inclusion. Preliminary evidence on the Syrian case that I understand definitely echoes that. Many local councils gained legitimacy because they were seen as locally embedded, because they were seen as responsive and inclusive, or perhaps is embodying the revolutionary spirits. It wasn't necessarily a question of which services or how many services were delivered. It obviously varied tremendously case to case. Another sort of complicating factor on this was that embedded in this service delivery brings legitimacy assumption was this idea that in this way civilian institutions could compete with armed actors for the population support. This is a reminiscent of the hearts and minds counterinsurgency logic as well. As this audience also knows, in practice in Syria, it certainly was not that straightforward, and wartime orders force pragmatic cooperation as well as competition. It's often not, and the population often didn't have the luxury of choosing civilians over armed actors. So it was very blurry in practice. Second way that I see the liberal state building model transposed here is the focus on capacity building as a means of legitimation. So this is another tenet of the liberal state building model. Many of you have probably seen this in other contexts. Iraq certainly comes to mind. It's this idea that state weakness is the central problem, and the solution for this is a lot of trainings. In the Syrian context, these trainings happen mostly in Turkey, happening largely with a very technocratic conception of what was being trained. Some of the skills and curricula looked like something that I would need if I were running an NGO project, rather than necessarily skills or capabilities that are appropriate to the local Syrian political or social order. Often the capacity buildings were directed at the people who were already the highest capacity, those who were known to donors or highest capacity in the donor conceptualization. There's obvious problems and disconnects with having a lot of trainings and hotel rooms in Turkey versus the situation on the ground. And a sort of similar echo of other external state building, capacity building efforts is that these efforts were often really divorced from broader systems. They were very modular in nature, focused on ex-local council representatives rather than influencing vertical linkages or horizontal linkages. In the Syrian opposition case, obviously the broader question of the system into which these councils were to nest is a whole other question. So the third echo that I see to the liberal state building model speaks to that last point. There were many attempts to, quote, connect the bottom up to the top down. In the liberal state building model, this comes from the intuition that governance is a multi-layer game. Donor assistance needs to influence all sides and somehow make it all work together. As per historic evidence, this is much easier said than it is done. In the Syrian context, the challenges were particularly pronounced because there was an obvious disconnect between many local councils and their daily lived experience in the conflict versus such bodies as the SOC and the assistance unit and later the SIG, who were on the outside. External donors tried to build legitimacy for these external umbrella bodies by what I view as pretty clumsy efforts, such as putting stickers, ACU stickers on an ambulance as it went across the border. These were efforts to accrue goodwill in the eyes of the population for these external actors across the border. Clearly that approach had shortcomings. In any context, questions of attribution and who gets credit are often not straightforward, but in this particular context, the effort to legitimate external bodies, I think, was particularly hard to come by. Final echo I see to the liberal state building experience is on donor coordination. This is one of the recurrent themes of essentially every external state building endeavor. Civ-Mil coordination, multiple agency coordinations, multiple donor coordinations. Syria had it all. There was a lot of overlaps of programs and objectives, as well as obvious gaps as well. Even within the US government, we had multiple parts of state or US aid, often working with the same local counterparts or having overlapping trainings. In a country where the needs were so great, there's obviously problems with that approach. So donor coordination was a tremendous problem, just like historic experience. So what do we take from all this? Looking ahead, as the Syrian conflict moves into, or sort of continues to evolve, why does that matter, that we on the donor side transpose so many historic shortcomings onto this different context? For me, it simply underscores that as we learn time and time again, we need a heavy dose of humility, a heavier dose of local understanding, and constructive learning from the past as we think about how to approach these efforts. I think from the donor side, there's often an impetus to do something. Doing something is better than doing nothing, and often that is true, but often a heavy dose of local context awareness and understanding of the complexities, I think, would serve us well. Maha well laid out some of the challenges now as any talk moves to reconstruction. Obviously, that paradigm will be very different from donor support to opposition local councils, but I do think these lessons are worth holding on to because we have seen some of these movies before, and I truly hope we can learn from them. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Francis. Okay, we have half an hour for questions or comments. Silakhtar, please. Can we have a microphone?
Thank you very, very much. I greatly enjoyed listening to all of you. And in this little time, I have learned much more than I have in much longer time with other people. I'm going to tell you some of the problems one faces on the ground. In 1997, when I was appointed to Afghanistan for the first time, nothing was happening in Afghanistan. So one had the luxury of trying to learn a little bit. So I got together 5 specialists, one from Australia, one from Pakistan, one from Afghanistan, one from the United States, and one from France. We spent two days together. And so I knew absolutely nothing about Afghanistan till then. So when I started, that was extremely helpful. But when I was asked to go to Iraq, I didn't have that luxury at all. I was dragged into Iraq. I didn't want to go to Iraq. I was dragged into Iraq because I knew Iraq. But by the time I got to Iraq, the Iraq I knew had disappeared, completely disappeared. I knew nothing, nobody, absolutely nobody. Again, when I went to Afghanistan before that, the second time, 2001, then of course, I didn't have the time or the luxury to get a few people together and see where Afghanistan had gone and where to go. We had to really start swimming, right from the first moment. One of the first things we had to do was to prepare for an appeal for funds. We arrived in Afghanistan on the 21st of December, 2001, and the appeal conference was in Tokyo on the 22nd of January, 1 month, to prepare an appeal about a country that nobody knew anything about. So we had the World Bank and the UNDP sitting together. There was one Afghan amongst them who knew something, but he was not living in Afghanistan. So they prepared the documents for the appeal, but we were much more fortunate in that I had taken Ashraf Ghani, who was in the World Bank. He studied in this university too. And he revised that work, and so we went to Tokyo with something presentable. In Syria, you speak of donors. I don't call them donors. They were not there as donors. They were there as people trying to change Syria. They were not donating money. They were not reconstructing anything. They were trying to change. They were trying to get rid of Bashar al-Assad. That's what they were doing. And they were speaking, as you mentioned now, of the day after. And the day after for them was literally tomorrow. Because Bashar was going to fall yesterday. It's gone, finished. So, hurry up, what are we going to do? And I had, terrible time telling them, yeah, there is a tomorrow, but it's not tomorrow. There is a day after, but it's not tomorrow. We have plenty of time. And you see, we were saying that there is no military solution. Nobody believed us. On the contrary, this made our life extremely difficult, because the supporters of Bashar were saying, if you say there is no political, that means you mean Bashar is not going to win. And the opposition was saying, you are with Bashar. You want to protect Bashar. It took 2 years for people to stop saying there is a military solution. 2 years. It is until 2013, out of shame, saying tomorrow Bashar is going to do. So at one time they were speaking of a plane already in the airport of Damascus to take Bashar and his family out of the country. In 2013, they started to say, yeah, there is no military solution. But nobody was working for a political solution. Everybody was continuing to work for a military solution. So these are the practical problems that you face when you are trying to manage a conflict. You have the same problems when you are trying to rebuild after a conflict. A conflict does not stop, one day the conflict finishes today and the post-conflict starts tomorrow. It doesn't work that way. The conflict lingers on for a very, very, very long time. In Afghanistan, unfortunately, it has been lingering on for 15 years. We were really in a post-conflict situation in December 2001 and January 2002, but by 2004, we were not in a post-conflict situation. We were half post-conflict and half. So these are the practical problems that you face when you are trying to start thinking of rebuilding and actually. And then you saw the liberal model that you have. What is the liberal model? Elections. Go for elections as early as you can. Delaying election was we went to Washington to beg, say, why elections in January 2005? Let's wait a little bit. Let the people, breathe a little bit. Let them get, prepare for. No, because the election was not for Iraq. It was for the election, for the re-election of Mr. Bush. So it couldn't be postponed. But even if there isn't an election for a Mr. Bush somewhere, going for an election early is also, a kind of necessity. Look at South Africa. They took 4 years after the liberation of Mandela to organize the election, and it was a messy election. Very, very, very messy. I was there. But they had leaders. They had Mandela and de Klerk, who actually negotiated the results of the elections in their office, in place so and so. Of course, it is the ANC. In KwaZulu-Natal, the ANC won, but give it to Buthelezi to have peace, because they had leaders. Even 4 years was not enough. The same thing about the Constitution. How are you going to write a constitution with people who still have their knives behind their back? You bring them and say, write a Constitution is written by people who already have an idea how they want to live together. So, I was pleading with the United Nations to actually have a model of a provisional fundamental law, one page. Equality between people, equality between men and women, these usual things. And then let the people prepare their constitution at leisure. But for this, you see, the long term does not exist in international relations these days. The long term is 4 years. That's the election cycle in the West. And also this, we have got to really fight the idea that the Western liberal system is something that can be implanted everywhere in 3 months. I think it takes a little bit more than that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Please, yes. The gentleman, and then.
Hello, Sari Hanafi, Sociology Department, American University of Beirut. Thank you so much for all the panelists, but I have two comments. One to Franz Braun. Thank you. I'm not sure the political imaginary of United States in Syria is following a liberal paradigm of state building. I mean, if I refer to 2 days ago, an interview with Ambassador Ford, only commenting why United States supported PYD in the north and not the Free Syrian Army, which you have a moderate constitution. So because the imaginary is ethnic and often sectarian, this is the paradigm in Iraq. So United States, like France, like many donors, they want elite formation to specific elite. They want elite that they like, and this is why this distort the whole dynamics. Yeah, my second point, just to tease ISQA, as I see Madame Khawla is there, to say the way ISQA handled the issue of reconstruction for Syria is extremely different what the model presented by Maha Yahya. I mean, the junction between reconstruction and transitional justice is not what I read from many literature produced by ISQA. So it's a serious difference, and really how we can jump into reconstitution without talking about not necessarily prosecution, but at least really a clear vision about what would be transition with democracy, social justice, rethinking political system, and so on.
Thank you. The young lady there, please, and then, yeah. Oh, okay. Okay, I want it anyway, since it's there. Okay, the gentleman.
Professor Assimani, first of all, thank you for the 5 lectures. I have a double question for the 5 lecturers. First one, do you think that MENA reconstruction can happen without a sincere internal consensus between different factions of the population in different states? For example, Syria, Libya, and actually Iraq and Yemen. I mean, are we going to see a new step or to watch a new step toward the globalization? And I mean that the West, Russia, USA, Europe, are going to reconstruct only the useful portions of all these states. For example, the oil state in Khalij and the oil parts of Libya or Iraq or Syria or Yemen. And the second question also, what will be, I would like to ask, what will be the profit for the local population of these states after the reconstruction? Everything will be delivered, I mean, by US, Europe, and Russia. And what we will gain in our countries? Only will provide the main d'oeuvre, only the workers? Thank you.
Please, the young lady.
Thank you for everyone. I'm Layana Dani. I'm a Syrian student at AUB studying political studies and public administration. I'm very interested in what all of you delivered in your speeches, and it's very incredible. What I see, as a PSPA student, that there is a contradiction. As a Syrian, I'm talking about the case in Syria, that there is a contradiction in the situation in Syria. For example, now we're talking about reconstruction, and on the other hand, in Russia, they're talking about a new constitution for the country, and the opposition side is not present in the conference. And on the other side, as Mrs. Frances Brown said about the donor and the relation with the opposition local councils. But this later on will create distortions and dependencies that will later on, it would be difficult to overcome by the local opposition people. And on the other hand, the reconstruction planning is very difficult because the country is already now divided into 4 zones. So, from your perspective, from which level of planning we should start thinking? Because, to overcome the complexity of the situation, and because, if we said we're going to give money to the country in order to start reconstructing, the regime is going to take control of this. And if we said that we want to rebuild the cities, I believe building is not gonna push the situation to any place peacefully, because buildings, this is a later on level that we can talk about. But the most important thing is to find a very peaceful planning, reconstruction, and I don't know from which level of planning we should start thinking. Thank you.
Thank you. The lady here, please.
Hi, Catherine Skanke-Iglesias. I'm a demographer and have done some consulting with NGOs here in Lebanon, mainly dealing with the Syrian refugees. But I was interested in what your view is of the role of the state in the region with regard to population flows. Right now we have a lot of talk about the Syrians migrating out. And do you see that, for example, in the Gulf, we had a lot of temporary labor coming from South Asia, from East Africa. When you look at rebuilding some of the Arab states, do you think that that kind of labor flow is still going to happen with globalization? Or are the states going to attack the unemployment within the country? So, for example, with Libya 2.0 you mentioned. So how do you look at the state's role with regard to temporary visas, worker visas, and sort of having a policy standpoint also? Because again, I'm more concerned about the high unemployment that there seems to be and a high number of refugees. It seems like there's a lot of a labor pool within the region that could be addressed, but I know that there's a lot of international migration from other regions coming in as well. So could you talk about that?
Mm-hmm. Yes, please.
Thomas Schellen, UPF Lebanon and Executive Magazine. More of a journalist's question, if you permit. Dr. Shehadi spoke about the springs that are being loaded and have been loaded maybe in 1989 in Eastern Europe, or pre-1989 in Eastern Europe, and pre-2011 in Arab Spring. Now, is your view that Syria is now currently being loaded again for a post-conflict period of internal overheating of the spring and eruption of the spring into some other conflict within the 10 years after period? Or do you feel a little more hopeful and, planning about the planning ability to plan for peace in the post-reconstruction? Thank you.
Right. Yes, please.
Good morning. My name is Salim, coming from Esqua, and it's a pleasure to be an economist among all these political scientists here. So, I have some complimentary comments, to be honest, about the role that we talked a lot about donors and official development aid that might be transferred to such countries. And going back to what Dr. Khawla said about the Rethinking Fiscal Policy report that we had at Esqua, and we're not there still to build or for the toward the 2030 agenda, and it gets even harder for countries that are in conflict. So I have a couple of points on official development aid and donors, and based on our evidence and countries' experience that has been that encountered the civil conflict, that official development aid might not suffice for an inclusive development plan that captures the short-term needs of humanitarian aid and the long-term needs, such as the reconstruction of infrastructure and human capital. So official development aid, it's not the only way of reconstruction, or the only resources that requires that is used for reconstruction. One additional thing is we know that the way resources are mobilized, whether it's from official development aid or from domestic drivers such as the fiscal policy and debt drivers for countries in the post-conflict era, might create a difference. So state building might require also a complementary economic plan that captures these short-term needs, such as the short-term consumption and humanitarian aid, and the long-term needs such as infrastructure, health, education, etc. At the same time, to end growth diagnostics homework that will prioritize economic activities that will generate fast resources that will feed into the state building eventually, to avoid additional episodes of civil conflicts after any civil war. This is my comment. Thank you.
Thank you. If there are no more questions or comments, I'll turn to the panelists. Maha?
Thank you, Khawla, and thank you everyone for the interesting questions. Just very quickly, can MENA reconstruction happen without internal reconciliation? Yes, it can. I mean, there's nothing, so long as we're not looking at these two things in the same framework. Already reconstruction has happened in multiple different places without effective reconciliation. One in Lebanon is one such place where this happened. However, does this make for a sustainable peace? Does this make for a sustainable future? No. Particularly in contexts, as I mentioned earlier, that have witnessed significant and horrific fracturing of societies. So I think that work, and when we talk about reconciliation, I think it's also become, as Renat put it, a kind of a buzzword these days. I think we need to also understand reconciling whom with whom, and how this is what happens at the level of a national dialogue is very different from what happens at the level of a particular area or a particular neighborhood. We're already seeing in some parts of Iraq tribes coming in to try and create reconciliation mechanisms. So I think these things vary from place to place, but definitely reconstruction can happen without them. It just doesn't mean that, these were the kinds of questions I was trying to raise. What do we mean by reconstruction? The idea is, what will the local populations benefit? I think it depends on the modus operandi and how reconstruction takes place. Will local reconstruction happen in Lebanon? When reconstruction happened in Lebanon, rebuilding, there was Lebanese labor, but also companies benefited, as well as internationals. So I think it just depends on the way things are set up. There are opportunities not only for the countries. I mean, Lebanon is preparing itself for the potential reconstruction of Syria. So I think the kind of benefits that could accrue from the physical aspect in terms of economic cycles is there. But again, this will not make for a stable reconstruction by a long shot if the political aspects of reconstruction, of rebuilding, if the political settlement itself is not sound, we're back where we started. If we're going to rebuild in Syria with the current regime, and therefore that will use the funding for reconstruction in order to reinforce its hegemony, in order to reconsolidate its authoritarian power in ways that are much worse than what we had prior to 2011, then I doubt many people will benefit, neither in the short nor long term. The role of the state with regards to population flows, yes, of course it has a significant role. I think you're mixing two things there. There's the population flows that are happening internally within states as a result of conflict, and these are the internally displaced. Of course, the states have significant role to play in that. There's refugee flow. That is happening, and I think Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey are the frontline states today that are dealing with this. I think here it's a regional and an international responsibility to deal with how do we provide better lives. It's not just about giving them shelter, but it's actually providing dignified lives. So I think this is not just a state responsibility, but is a regional and an international one. In terms of migrant workers, I think there we're moving into something completely different in terms of which states are you asking about in terms of their responsibility. Is it the states where the migrant workers have come from or where they are being hosted? There are close, I think, to 100 million, around 1 million nationals from the Philippines working in Saudi Arabia today. So are you asking about the responsibility of Saudi Arabia to go towards those migrant workers, or I wasn't clear on that part?
The question was also because of, even with Syrians in Lebanon right now, there's a significant proportion of Lebanese which they're labeling as vulnerable Lebanese.
Yes.
So just like with any international migration, sometimes the local residents are saying we are being displaced from the economy because of the...
So you're talking about displacement from the economy, not...
So for example, when you have a significant proportion of vulnerable Lebanese that are unemployed, but you're still bringing in or allowing, the state is still allowing refugees and other temporary laborers from other countries to come in. Sometimes the Lebanese that are unemployed are saying we're being displaced from the labor market because of the others coming in. So I just was talking about the role of the state and the Arab region in general. So Nadim was talking about, what is the role of the state? What is the model or ideal state? What would that state do? And what is it doing? Because right now there is some issue within every country, including the U.S., with the native population that's unemployed, saying that you're still letting others in and we don't have jobs, that kind of thing.
I think that's mixing apples and oranges, in all honesty. I'm not talking about just in the general logic of there are vulnerable Lebanese. There is a race to the bottom amongst the poorest of the Lebanese and the poorest of Syrian refugees. There is some displacement that's happening within informal sectors, but it's not as significant as it is being discussed. And this can be addressed in a number. The answer is not to shut down on either refugees working, nor is it to shut down on migrant workers coming to Lebanon. Many of the jobs that migrant workers are occupying in Lebanon are jobs that Lebanese are refusing to do. So let's be very clear. And you see the same patterns everywhere else.
Globally, we see
so
that,
I think we need to be careful about not mixing these things together, and definitely shutting down borders is not the response. Finally, in terms of where do we start, I'm as stumped as you are in terms of where do we start. I mean, there is no magic pill. In Syria, you have a situation where you have a regime that is trying to reconsolidate its control over the rest of Syria. I think we're in for a very long period of instability in Syria at the rate we're going. I don't think it has the capacity to control the country as it used to and the ways it used to without significant external support. There's a moment where it's going to start clashing with that external support, where interests are going to diverge. I don't know when that is going to happen. Meanwhile, providing any kind of support under the regime and allowing it to use that in terms of service delivery will allow us to reconsolidate our power and re-legitimize the regime, I think is a mistake. This does not mean, however, there are still areas that are still outside of state control. My concern also is, and this comes back, I think something Francis can talk about, is now everybody's talking about stopping all the support to the different local councils that were set up in opposition-held areas at the time. There's significant experience that has been accrued there, and that is transferable, and that one can build on to perhaps begin or plant the seeds of what could be the model of Syria that Syrians have been asking for. I'll just leave with one last comment. In our work with refugees over the past year in Lebanon and in Jordan, every time we ask them, what is the Syria you aspire to? What is the Syria you think of? The words they used were the words of liberal democracy. They talked about freedom, they talked about rights, they talked about dignity. They weren't talking about going back under any political settlement, and certainly not under the current regime. So let's be clear, they're not willing to compromise their rights to freedom, to justice, to dignity, to dignified lives for anything in the world, even if they continue living in atrocious situations in Lebanon and in Jordan.
Okay, thank you, Maha. And I think otherwise you'll lose the lunch break, so I'll give each panelist 2 minutes.
Thank you.
Sorry for that.
I'll jump in very, very quickly, so just to come to answer some of the questions. I think when it comes to one minor assumption that we've made here that I think is a naive one is that we're talking about post-conflict. Still in conflict. We're still going to witness more conflict, and I think we're just getting started, particularly when it comes to Libya. And I think when it comes to... I think when it does come to elections, I think we could spark off more conflict, and I think that's where Libya is perhaps heading. And to answer the gentleman's question regarding reconstruction and the useful parts of it or not, I think in the absence of conditionality, and I think there will be a massive absence of political conditionality, we'll have perhaps some degree of conditionality on which countries are tasked with the reconstruction, because Libya is in theory a wealthy country, and if it's not wealthy then it will take a loan, and that is going to significantly change the way that Libya's sovereignty, political sovereignty and economic sovereignty where that's concerned. So, we may not, the West may not pay for it, but they'll be reaping the profits by rebuilding. And I think that's one of the main causes, because if you speak about the absence of conditionality and not being able to address the root causes, then what do you do for the prospects of peace building? There are two things that I think we're missing in parts of what I said about local reconstruction in Libya, and I think the two really important elements are, A, this issue of property rights in Libya, which I'm sure is the case in Syria, I'm sure it's the case in Iraq, but these are significant two waves of it. Law number 4, I think it was passed in 1970-something under Gaddafi, which removed the rights of those. It effectively allowed the dweller of a home to become the owner of a home. That rampantly changed the way that Libya's wealth was distributed and ownership was distributed. But also since the conflict in Benghazi, for example, we speak about displaced people in Benghazi and in Libya very much so, but there's also a displaced private sector. Much of Libya's wealth, much of Libya's private sector and those that owned and operated businesses have left the city. So what do they do, and what is their role when it comes to reconstruction? How do we reconstruct society without those individuals involved? And what happens when you put a lot of money into a place with highly contested property rights, the moving and removing of ownership of those companies to people that have just announced that I own this hospital, I own this mechanics, I own this logistics company, and just say, well, we'll reconstruct it for you. Do you want to have it? Do you want to look at my deeds? No, not really. So I mean, that's really where you begin to heighten the competition. When it comes to what the lady here was talking about in terms of unemployment rates, I think in Libya the difficulty has been, and it is something connected to what Maha was saying, is that absolutely there are jobs that Libyans deem socially or culturally, we just don't do this. La wallahi ma afwan ma'alish yani. We don't do that. I don't get my hands dirty. Agriculture, waste management, for example, are two things that jump to mind. But skilled labor is really, really important in Libya. And I think there could be a case for the German model, which was to take, the German model to take Syrian refugees, the creme de la creme, the educated, multilingual, skilled people that have arrived to Germany, and to distribute them into the rural areas, and that's what they did in Germany. But I mean, perhaps they wittingly or unwittingly, but I think that's what's happened in Germany. In Libya, there's almost this kind of maybe misstepping of doing that, and we don't know whether or not. I mean, there is certainly a desire and appetite, given hyperinflation, given a really difficult economic crisis, for Libyans to now learn skilled labor and to enter the workforce into desirable jobs. But again, we forget that when it comes to something that you mentioned about the Gulf states. Gulf states, by the way, have horrendous labor rights, absolutely not interested in visas and giving visas to those people that will eventually, and I'll give an anecdote because it's something that I remember from 2012, in an unnamed Gulf state that I went to, in a conference and a speech that someone gave there, he said, come here and make money, come here and have a nice time in our malls, but don't do politics. And I don't think he was speaking to people like myself, because I'm Libyan, he doesn't care about me, we're not going to come over and do politics there. He's speaking about people that want to get jobs there. Come earn money, send remittances back to your country, but don't talk about politics here. And I think that's something that the Gulf states have not only showed domestically, but they've transposed that model. And it's something that Francis is saying about this liberal state building model that is being transposed by Western donors. We forget that the Gulf states have transposed their own models back onto Arab states as well. And they're succeeding because they have more pound for their, they have more bang for their buck. And they're the ones that are infringing upon the arms embargoes. If you want to look at where the arms are going and where they come from, they're the ones that are really kind of showing that where the mill is. So, yeah, I'll leave it there.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, I'll be very brief because I think people have already answered most of the questions. In Iraq, Iraqis like to sort of use a sense of humor to deal with what's happened. So in Mosul, one of the jokes today is we finally have pyramids. We have 3 pyramids, but it's the pyramids of rubble that they have, and they say we finally have the modern wonder of what is an ancient wonder. And they say it laughing. So clearly, reconstruction moving forward is key. When we talk about reconciliation, I feel bad because, I don't want to be the guy, we're all sort of bashing reconciliation, but yeah, what is reconciliation? You have, talk about the Yazidis. Okay, the Yazidis were massacred. There are Yazidis on one side fighting against Yazidis on the other side at the moment. You have KDP Yazidis, you have PKK Yazidis. So what do we mean by reconciliation? Do we mean put a Yazidi next to a Sunni, next to a Shia? Because you can do that, and we are doing that, and it's not translated. Or does it mean put the leader with the citizen, put the elite with the citizen, and have them come to terms, right? So as I say, in Iraq, it's almost like there's a greater level of maturity amongst the Iraqis at the moment because they're realizing that corruption and issues are more important, and yet what we're hearing internationally are concepts like reconciliation, concepts like identities, concepts like bringing people together. So I think there needs to be a bit of a balance there because it's very fragile. And we can see that this sort of shift towards issue politics could fragment again. And I think the Kurdish referendum was a risk at that, but it's prevailed since then. So again, I think the key here has to be between the citizen and the elite rather than stressing identities.
Thank you, Rina. Nadeem?
Thank you. So I'll start with the question that was addressed to me, whether the springs are being loaded again in Egypt. I think so. Certainly, it's gone back, and there'll be more pressure, and it's sustainable if the Gulf states keep pouring 25 billion a year into the Egyptian economy. But it's totally unsustainable in the long run. In Syria, it's in Syria it's more comparable to Iraq between 91 and 2003, where we maintained Saddam in power consciously for fear of the unknown, and allowed him to massacre his people, destroy his cities. The Marsh Arabs were 500,000. There were 30 to 50,000 left by the time he's finished with them. Oil for food strengthened him. So when after 2003, what we saw is not the result of removing Saddam. It's the result of having him stay there for so long. So Same with Libya and other places. Now about MENA, about consensus, achieving consensus. I think consensus is a bit overrated because, I mean, we had. How do you achieve consensus? By stopping dissent, by elections of 97.6%. People get elected by. I think it's more legitimacy, and legitimacy is intangible. I can't tell you how legitimacy is established and how it falls. The American system, for example, has a kind of legitimacy. When George Bush was elected, after there was a lot of contest, and after the last count in Florida, people accepted it. There was no more talk about it. It's the fact that people believe in the legitimacy of the system and don't question it.
Donald Trump.
Well, the dictators, even dictators, I mean, even.
In audience, we are in the Near East, not in America.
No, well, in the Near East, you even had dictatorships that had legitimacy for a while, and almost consensus, and they were stable. They remained in power. They could walk in the street without bodyguards. People love them. So but once they lose it, the only way they can keep it is by destroying the country, and that's where we are now. So it's restoring legitimacy rather than consensus. Now the role of the state, I would just in refugees, I would add the role of international institutions too. I mean, UNHCR is not here to facilitate the movement of refugees. It almost hinders them because it protects the states rather than the refugees. And I mean, the example is that after World War II, before the convention, there were 20 million German refugees from Europe, from Eastern Europe. They were settled, nobody knows how, through small human relations. Yeah, of course it's different. Hezbollah, after Hezbollah's war in 2006, the refugees the displaced went back in 24 hours. If we had asked UNHCR to take them back, they would still be making an assessment. Yeah, and negotiating with Israel and making consensus. And so that's I mean, just one additional word about donor coordination, and that I think it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for donors to coordinate.
Thank you, Nadim. Francis?
Very quickly, responding to one of Maha's comments on local council expertise, I completely agree, and tragically this is another one of these comparative lessons. Time and again, we build up local structure or any kind of structure on a project basis, and then when the project ends, we throw the baby out with the bathwater. I truly hope that we can learn some of those lessons when it comes to all that's been gained in terms of local capacity. Ambassador Brahimi, I wanted to respond to your note about the push for elections. I completely agree. As you know very well, this comes from an assumption that elections will lead to accountability and greater responsiveness and thus greater legitimacy, this word we keep talking about. Of course, we actually know in comparative evidence that pushing too soon can actually be destabilizing. I do think Afghanistan, even later, was also a great example of this. In 2009 and 2014, a push led to a heavily flawed election in both cases that then led to a backroom sort of arrangement and deal, a country on the verge of conflict. And that ultimately results in a government that's not necessarily more legitimate in the eyes of the populace. So it's a tension. I obviously don't have the answers. On the liberal state building model, sometimes being illiberal in practice, certainly your point is well taken. My critique was of the way it had been operationalized. I think we all agree with the tenets of liberal democracy, or I certainly do. My critique is entirely on how external state building interventions have unfolded. and they do lead to illiberal outcomes in practice many times. This is also a great time to underscore I no longer speak for the US governments in any of my comments. And finally, on what level to plan, where do we start? It's such an important question and such a tough one. Like Maha, I don't have any good answers for you. I think best practice in buzzwords is proper sequencing, multi-layer game, thinking about national, regional, localized, and vertical linkages. In Syria, for the reasons you point out, that's even more complicated than in other interventions. Syria is a geopolitical competition wrapped in a regional competition, wrapped in a collective action problem, wrapped in a riddle, wrapped in an enigma. So I don't have any answers, but I've appreciated this opportunity to discuss with all of you.
Thank you. Thank you, Francis. Thank you, Nadim, Maha, Rinad, and Anas. Thank you all. And I think this brings the end of this session. Thank you, and thank you for your patience and listening and participation. Thanks a lot.